Dr. Foster, can I just pick up on one further issue in relation to the CSVM process? You've told us about the modules. If you'd had, say, a larger number operating because you had more plasma to process, what were the implications for that, as it were, for the downstream in terms of the production process? Was the rest of PFC equipped to keep up?
To a large extent, yes, because when you get to the end of that process, the main product is albumin, and that is dispensed into bottles. You then get into batch size. You can make the batch size as big as you like virtually. Then it has to be pasteurized. We had very large pasteurizing cabinets, so that wouldn't have been an issue. We could have dealt with that relatively easily. The main issue then becomes storage. And I think we had, at one point, we used quite a lot of off-site storage because we didn't have enough, and the medicine inspectors weren't comfortable with that. They preferred to have it more secure on-site, and eventually we did actually have an extension. And I ought to say that Mr. Watt always imagined there would be an extension to PFC for these purposes, and he'd even built in the end wall of PFC. He called it a false wall. It was always his intention that that was a wall that could be easily taken down to, once the extension had been built, just to join the existing PFC with a new extension. And that did happen, but only in the 1990s and only for Scotland's needs.
So I won't take time going to it, but there is an article by Dr. Foster and Mr. Watt about the CSVM process, exhibited to Dr. Foster's statement at WITN 69144039, which has got diagrams and photographs that certainly I personally found useful in understanding how the process worked. Can I then move to the Medicines Inspectorate and the inspection processes? Now, I think you told the Penrose Inquiry you weren't directly involved in licensing issues, but you had knowledge, I think, of what was going on, partly based on conversations with Mr. Watt, and also, as a matter of fact, you accompanied the inspectors on their first inspection.
That's right. It was the policy of the inspector that someone from the organisation should accompany them to take notes, so they wouldn't have to be bothered writing things down. They could just push on, and somebody else would do all the writing down of the issues that they found, and I was nominated to do that. So I spent 2 weeks with the inspectors going to, because the inspection process lasted a week in December, then a week in January 1980, and I was kind of cheek by jowl with them throughout the inspection, writing down everything that they said, and that essentially my notes formed the basis of their report.
And if we go to, please, ARCH 609, this is part of your oral evidence to the Archer inquiry. It's a convenient point to pick up some information about the process. If we go to page 25, please. We can, if we pick the picture up at line 12, you say plasma products are prescription-only medicines. For legal purposes, they come under the Medicines Act. Government body responsible for enforcing this act is the MHRA, formerly the MCA. And then you talk about two different types of licence, two principal types of licence which were awarded. A manufacturer's licence, which demonstrates that a premises and their operation are available for the manufacture...
Are suitable,
for the manufacture of pharmaceutical products. And a product licence, sometimes known as a marketing authorisation, which demonstrates that a product has been judged to be suitable for the clinical use specified. Now, I'm going to be asking you about the manufacturer's licence, because that was what the inspection, as I understand it, was concerned with. Now, is this right? We can keep this. If we keep this up on screen, please, for a moment, Sally. But is this right that when the PFC opened in its new premises, not long after that, your statement suggests that Mr. Watt was advised, that Mr. Watt wanted there to be an inspection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But his request for an inspection was declined. Do you know why that was?
I think the inspectors had higher priorities. They were relatively newly formed, and their priorities were hospital pharmacies, because lots of hospitals were making their own solutions, and I think ultimately they were virtually all closed down, and that was what they were focusing on at that time. And so we actually, and BPR, were seen as a lower priority.
And instead, your statement tells us Mr. Watt was advised just to apply for the manufacturer's licence, which was granted in 1976. That's for correct. A 5-year period. So when we look here at what you describe, the purpose of a manufacturer's licence as being, which to demonstrate that the premises and their operation are suitable for the manufacture of pharmaceutical products, in fact, the licence granted to PFC in 1976 was granted without any first-hand knowledge by the inspectorate or the Medicines Control Agency.
Yes, but the manufacturing licence is a very complete account of everything in the centre, down to every detail that Mr. Watt could imagine. It was a very, very thorough document, and so it was assessed on that basis rather than, as you say, a direct visual inspection.
We can take that down now then. Now, in relation to that first inspection, the end of 79 and the beginning of 1980, if we go to PRSE 0002985, please. Sorry, just find the right document. So we've got here the report of the inspection. We've got the dates December 79, January 1980, objective to assess the manufacturing operations from a pharmaceutical viewpoint. We've got the list of senior personnel who were met, including yourself, and then we've got the names of DHSS representatives at the bottom. And then if we go over the page, we've got a summary. The inspection of the PFC completed in January 1980, and then there's reference to Mr. Watt having presented the DHSS with a considerable amount of data. And then this deficiencies noted in the PFC operations have been extracted from sections 1 to 4, presented in section 5 of the report. These shortcomings may be grouped into those relating to premises, personnel, procedures, documentation, and records and equipment. Although many of the points raised in section 5 may be considered minor as individual points, when they're grouped, they reflect a lack of total quality assurance in an otherwise well-run scientific operation. And then if we go to page, I think it's going to be page 5, first of all. Before we look at section 5 of the report, I just want, oh, no. Go to the next page, please. That's it. So just under the heading General Introduction, wanted to pick it up in the 3rd paragraph, where the report records this: owing to the period of financial stringency in the early 70s, the industrial complex was not completed as originally planned. This, Mr. Watt indicated, has been detrimental to the blood fractionation operations in Edinburgh. Do you know what that is referring to?
No, I really don't. I don't know. I do know that Mr. Watt was always unhappy with some of the building construction, and he would get into a lot of arguments about it because it was being run by the Lothian Health Board building division, and their experience was with building hospitals, not pharmaceutical facilities. So I think there was some tension at that point, and some of that could have been financial, really related to finance.
If we then go to section 5 of the report, I'm going to try the paragraph numbers, but mine's not numbered. Sorry, page numbers. Can we try page 51, please, Sally? Next page. Yes, so if we go to the bottom of that page, there's a heading, Summary of Deficiencies Noted During Inspection, and then there are a range of deficiencies identified. I'm not proposing to read them out, but we see an example at the bottom of the page, which was premises where, in relation to the initial handling of blood, open laboratory, thoroughfare without adequate control. And then over the page, there's a range then of what might be viewed in isolation, as the inspector said, small points, but taken together, raised concerns. Is this right in particular about the risks of microbiological contamination?
Yes, that's correct. That was the inspector's overriding concern throughout the inspection.
Can we then just go on to page... So what page electronically are we on now, Sally? 53. If we go on a further 4 pages and see if that takes us to the right one. No, 1 page before that, please. Just wanted to pick up the section 5.1.6 and in particular 5.1.6.4. It refers to plasma being hepatitis B surface antigen tested at regional centres. However, a positive statement as to plasma HBsAg status is not presented. Do you know what that referred to in particular?
I'm not sure what that means, except it possibly just a confirmation that they came with the plasma to confirm that it had been tested, rather than just assuming that having left the centre and sent to PFC it had been tested. But you'd be better asking Bob Perry about that.
And then if we go on to the conclusions, which should be another 14 pages, I think, further on, Sally. Nearly, but no, not quite. Can you go another 10 pages? Sorry. That's it. Conclusions. So the conclusions of this first inspection, plasma fractionation and associated operations are not carried out under conditions of good manufacturing practice. They do not comply because of the deficiencies in premises personnel, procedures, production, quality control and maintenance, documentation, and thus total quality assurance. 7.2, however, a basis on which a good manufacturing unit could be established does exist. 7.3, staff are extremely conscientious and competent in fractionation procedures, but it's apparent there's a lack of knowledge, experience and awareness of the requirements of GMP in the pharmaceutical aspects of sterile products. If an undertaking is given to rectify the deficiencies cited within a reasonable period of time, then the manufacturing operations presently undertaken should be permitted to continue. We would define a reasonable period of time as being 2 years. It would be unwise, taking account of 7.1, to increase the scale of manufacture at this point. However, when the deficiencies have been rectified, this imposition on product range and volume of production could be reconsidered. Now, is it right to understand from your statement and other evidence you've given that neither Mr. Watt nor you were particularly surprised by the identification of the range of criticisms that the report set out?
No, that would be correct, because as you've established earlier this week, the design of PFC was largely finalised around about 1970, and that was before any of these guidelines had become available. And by this point in time, 10 years later, we're now in the second edition of the GMP guidelines, and so clearly the building wasn't built with that knowledge available, and I think Mr. Watt was keen to develop it in conjunction with the inspectors rather than try and get ahead of that and then find out he'd done it wrongly. He wanted to do it jointly with the inspectors, and that was why he was so keen to have inspections so early on. And I think that the fact that that was delayed was unfortunate.
Paragraph 7.5 on this page it indicates that the inspectors were discouraging increasing the scale of manufacture at that point in time until the deficiencies had been rectified. Did that have an impact at that point in time upon the PFC's ability to take more plasma for fractionation?
I don't think it did. And it might help. I do remember very clearly what the issue was, because, as you know, I was with the inspectors, and they were most concerned about the fact that the bottle that we used for albumin had a screw top, and they thought that might be an opportunity for bacteria to sort of crawl up the screw into the top into the bottle, and they wanted that replaced with a more modern type of container. Now, the container we were using, which is the same as the one BPL was using, was called an MRC bottle. It had been approved by the Medical Research Council, but by now it was out of date in terms of pharmaceutical practice. And so we had to change over to an alternative bottle, and that was the critical issue that they were concerned about, from my memory.
Now, there was a second inspection in October 1981. Do you recall how that came about? Was that the inspectors coming back to see what had been done since their first inspection?
I'm sure it was a follow-up. Obviously, it was a follow-up to the previous inspection. I wasn't involved with this one, so I'm not in a position to talk about it in any detail.
Just, however, for the benefit of those listening, if we can look at that second inspection report, albeit obviously in the knowledge that you weren't performing the same function as you had previously, we've got a document at BNOR 40572. And if we go to the second page, we can see at the top of the page, some of the documents are a little indistinct, but it says, I think, following the response of the Protein Fractionation Centre to the inspection, a series of visits for discussions, possibly the word at or something like that, PFC has taken place to progress matters. These were held on the following dates, and then we've got dates in June 1981 and then September and 1st of October 1981. If we just go down to the bottom half of the page onto the heading General Comments, there's reference to the appointment of Dr. Perry as Quality Controller. Obviously, we can ask Dr. Perry about that. And then the last paragraph on that page refers to routine visits in the future will review progress of these aspects, and an in-depth inspection in approximately 3 months will be scheduled to cover these aspects and offer any necessary advice and recommendations. Did that happen, as far as you know, either a further inspection, in-depth inspection, or ongoing visits?
It didn't. Visits did begin again in 1984 on a less formal basis, because shortly after this, we were instructed by the Scottish Home and Health Department that we should not meet with the inspectors, and that any relations with them should be done by the Scottish Home and Health Department. And
do you know why the Scottish Home and Health Department gave that advice to the PFC?
The reason that was given was that we were under Crown immunity, therefore we were not required to do this. And Mr. Watt took great exception to that, and he was on the point of refusing to issue products until he got legal indemnity by the Scottish Health Department.
So is it right to understand from your recollection, Mr. Watt himself was happy for there to be further inspections?
Oh yes, he welcomed them.
But it was the Scottish Home and Health Department that put a stop to that?
Yes. Mr. Watt wanted PFC to be judged on the same standards as the commercial sector.
Now, I'm not going to go through some of the specific findings on the premises and facilities set out in this report, but if we can go to page 7.
I might add, before we leave this point, that when the inspections began in 1984, that was, of course, after Mr. Watt had left.
Yes.
And I think that the department were concerned that Mr. Watt was using the inspections and the inspectors to get more money than was justified.
And no doubt Dr. Perry may be able to assist us then in relation to events post Mr. Watt's departure. If we then go to page 7, we've got the conclusions. Again, it's not in entirely easy to read all of it, but 4.1 says progress towards implementing necessary standards of GMP in general quality assurance matters, including provision of standard process documents, standard operation procedures, is generally acceptable. A major effort regarding these aspects is now coming to fruition, and then 2 particular exceptions to that are noted. 4.2 says firm proposals to remedy those deficiencies regarding buildings and facilities as reported in the first inspection are still awaited with dates of implementation. These deficiencies are as defined in section 3 of the report. Now, as you weren't particularly closely involved with it, I'm not proposing to take you through the detail, but do you have any understanding as to why proposals to remedy certain deficiencies regarding buildings and facilities was still awaited at that point in time? Was that a question of funding?
It was entirely a question of funding, and funding from the Scottish Health Department had to be made available to do this.
And then we can see 4.3, the passage that's underlined, says the present buildings and facilities continue to fail to reach minimum standards of GMP, and a licence would not be recommended for an industrial equivalent unless agreed upgradings were instituted as a matter of urgency. Do you have any recollection of Mr. Watt's view on that conclusion or his response to this report?
I think he would. He was welcomed the inspection, this statement, and the strength of it, because that gave him more ability to try to get the funding that was needed.
Because essentially, the inspectors were saying, were they not, if we left aside Crown immunity and you were an ordinary manufacturing facility, you wouldn't be getting a licence unless you did something urgently to improve the position.
My understanding is the inspectors are stating their authority here. And of course, the problem for them was that they didn't have as much authority because of Crown immunity. So that this is my understanding of why it's worded that way. But it's essentially a statement of authority to try to put pressure on the Scottish Health Department to provide the funding. And Mr. Watt would have welcomed that.
Now, you've described in your statement what you said were 2 positive impacts from the inspections. So if we go to WITN 6914001, page 31, please. It's the bottom half of the page under the heading Impact on Virus Inactivation. You say, I believe the impact of the remedial actions agreed with the Medicines Inspectorate on the timescale for achieving virus inactivation were positive in 2 respects. The first is that permission was granted for the construction of a microbiology extension to PFC, for which plans had been drawn up in the mid-1970s, but which had not previously been authorised by SHHD. The main reason for approval being given for this extension was the provision of bacteriology laboratories which had been included in its design, which the Medicines Inspectorate had requested to enable PFC to be able to carry out its own bacteriological testing on site. Also included in the design of the microbiology extension were a Category 3 containment facility for work with dangerous pathogens, i.e. viruses, and an R&D pilot plant, which you referred to, Dr. Foster, before the break. Now, do you know why these facilities had not previously been authorised by the Scottish Home and Health Department?
Well, the short answer is no, but I assume it was just finance.
So your understanding is that the inspection report eventually had, in part at least, the outcome that Mr. Watt had hoped for, which was that it effectively put pressure on SHHD to provide funding for certain upgrades of the facilities to take place.
That's right.
And in terms of the impact longer term on work relating to virus inactivation, was the principal benefit in that regard the R&D pilot plant?
That was one of the benefits, yes.
What other benefits were there that might impact in terms of the development of viral inactivation methods?
Actually, I would just leave it there. It was the pilot plant allowed us to do more work on pasteurisation that we couldn't have done otherwise, and also the virology work, which we did not only for ourselves but for BPL, because they didn't have that facility.
And you refer to both of those over the top of the next page, in fact. On the first two paragraphs on that page. If the authorisation for the upgrading had been made earlier by the Scottish Home and Health Department, would it be right to understand that you might have, the team, the R&D team, might have been able to make use of those facilities earlier?
We would have used the facilities, but I don't think it would have advanced our work on achieving safe products in terms of viruses, because that was dependent on scientific breakthroughs, not just scale up, which is what this was concerned with.
Right. Well, we can pick that up when we look at pasteurisation and heat treatment tomorrow. Just then on issues relating to regulation and external agencies, if we go back to your evidence to the Archer inquiry, ARCH 6009, and we go to page 30, I think. Lines 11 and 12. Sorry, just in fact, I should think probably pick it up at the top of the page. You refer to there being no further licence applications made by SNBTS until Crown immunity was removed. Then you say the PFC continued to interact with the MCA, encouraging informal inspections acting on the advice given. And then there's a question from Lord Archer. And then you say this at lines 11 and 12, yes, we were in continuing dialogue with the agencies, even though that was not a formal arrangement. Which agencies were you referring to there? Is that simply the MCA?
Yes.
And do you know what, if any, dialogue there was with the MCA, with the inspectors, from 1981, when that second visit took place and the report was produced, through to 1984 when they returned?
No, I have no knowledge of that.
And who would have been most closely involved then? Would that be Mr. Watt and Dr. Perry?
That's correct.
I'd ask you next a little about pool sizes. I want to start, if I may, by taking you to a passage in your evidence to the Penrose inquiry. So that's PRSE 0006041, please. And if we go to, I think it should be page 38. So there's an exchange here, if we pick it up at line 8 and 9. You were asked about the use of the word batch and the use of and your statement that at the end of 1983 you'd be working with about 4,000 donations per batch. And then if we go to the next page, if we pick it up at line 14, you were asked this. So when we see references to a batch, we should understand by that the total of, say, 4,000 donations, that is, as it were, processed together. Is that right? And your answer was that's correct, yes. So can you just help us understand the reference there to batch and 4,000 donations? And then I just want to ask you a little more generally about pool sizes.
And are we talking just about factor 8?
Yes, for present purposes, yes.
Okay. As we talked about earlier, the process begins with thawing the plasma, and the that is done in the amount of plasma that is taken out of cold storage was a matter of production scheduling. And in the mid-70s until near the end of the 70s, that was done with a batch process. Excuse me. And that batch tank was sized, I think probably by Dr. Smith, to take about 150 litres at a time. By the late 1979, I was introducing this continuous process, and that allowed us to increase the volumes that we could manufacture. And we needed to increase the volume in order to increase the output of factor 8. That was the only mechanism we had available to do that. And that is why the pool size or the batch size increased to this number. It was so that we could maximize our output of factor 8. Because the challenge for us was to produce more factor 8 to minimize the amount of commercial factor 8 being used. And there was no other way we could do it other than by increasing pool size.
So it would be right to understand that then by the end of 1983 or thereabouts, you would have, if we use the terminology here, first of all, of donations, around 4,000 donations. So that would be probably 4,000 different donors.
That's correct. It would be typically between 800 and 1,000 litres of plasma would go into processing, and as an estimate, that could be up to 4,000 donations.
Okay. I think sometimes we see reference to litres, sometimes we see reference to kilograms in the material. Are you able to assist us with why the different measurements are used?
When the plasma is received into PFC, it's weighed so that there's a record of how much has been received from each centre. But it was provided, the plasma is contained in a plastic bag. The plastic bag is in a carton, and it's weighed like that. So some account was taken to remove the weight, the weight of the carton in a what was called a tear system, so that it was deducted from the weight. But the weight still included the weight of the plastic. So when you see kilograms of plasma, it's actually kilograms of plasma plus plastic. And we made some measurements of the amount of plastic, the weight of the plastic, but I don't know if that was adjusted from any of the figures that were used in annual returns of how much plasma was received. So my assumption would be that those figures of kilograms are plasma plus plastic. And of course, I think you discussed earlier in these proceedings that the density of plasma is not the same as the density of water, and therefore you can't say that 1 kilogram equals 1 litre. And so the only measurement of volume that we had was after the cryoprecipitate had been removed and the plasma had been thawed, and we would make that measurement as a volume, and the amount of cryoprecipitate was about 1% of that. So there was a slight decrease in volume. I hope this makes sense. But those are what those figures refer to. So you could either work with kilograms, bearing in mind that includes plastic and the density is different to litres, or you could work with litres, so that it is obviously confusing for people who are not familiar with what was taking place.
And then I just want to ask you to look at a written note produced by the inquiry, which the inquiry heard about yesterday afternoon. It's INQY 40346. Now, you I think, were travelling to London and weren't able to listen to the inquiry hearings yesterday. I just want to ask you to look at a couple of the charts and then really invite you to comment in the most general terms, because you won't have had any opportunity to look at any underlying material. If we go to page 9, there's a table at the top of the page which shows the period from 1978-79 through to 1983 to 84. And this is the inquiry's estimate, based upon various sources of data which have been identified in the note, of the changes in pool size in terms of expressed in litres and then estimated donations. And we see in broad terms an upward trajectory. Now, without expecting you to be able to say specific figures are or are not accurate, is that overall a picture that seems right to you from your own experience?
I would say the first line is incorrect. The 114 is far too small. It was more like 160. And I actually did prepare a report for Professor Cash where I documented every batch that was processed from 1975 right through into the early 80s, and every volume for every batch. And that report should be available in our system. And I don't remember it being as small as 114. It was typically 160. In 1979, there was a mixture because the batch process was 160, 167 here. But what was a pilot continuous thawing process ran at 300 litres. And then I had the full-scale continuous process came into use in 1981, and that went up to 1,000, up to 800 to 1,000 litres. So these figures are not really correct.
Okay. Well, it may be that you'll be able to provide us with any observations you have on the specific figures in writing. But is it right, if we just go perhaps to page 11, which provides at the bottom of the page a graphical overview, it's right, is it, to understand that there was an increase in pool sizes in this period from 78?
Yes, that's correct. As I said, that was the only way we could increase output, and the pressure on all of us was to provide more factor VIII concentrate.
What, if anything, was the impact of the capacity of the freeze dryers at the PFC to handle the plasma pools?
But that was the principal bottleneck in the process, and so you had to anticipate when you might need greater freeze drying capacity. And it took about 18 months to 2 years to obtain a new freeze dryer because these were made to order, specified and made to order, and it took a long time. So you really had to have that foresight to be able to plan ahead and to get the finance to bring in new freeze dryers. And we largely managed to do that. We never ran out of freeze drying capacity, except at one point where we were close to doing that, but we managed to insert an extra shelf in the freeze dryer by getting smaller vials from BPL that allowed us to do that. So that carried us through that difficult period.
So is it right to understand then that your evidence in this way, that the increase in pool sizes reflected the aim of achieving self-sufficiency domestically for Scotland, and thus not having to be reliant upon commercial concentrates?
Yes.
And then, can you tell us how and by whom decisions as to pool sizes or increases in pool sizes would be made at the PFC over this period?
That would be the director in conjunction with the production manager, and it was about really product scheduling in order to maximise output. But I should say that when we get into the early 80s, we did have the group that we talked about earlier, which Professor Cash was chairing, which was the Factor VIII study group. And under that, there was a group called the Safety Action Group, and they were really brainstorming on everything or anything that could be done to try to minimise or reduce risk. And from the notes that they prepared, I never saw any suggestion about pool sizes. But of course, we did have a small pool product that was cryoprecipitate, that was, to the best of my knowledge, always available from SMBTS.
Yes, and I'll come back to both cryoprecipitate and the issue of freeze-dried cryoprecipitate at a later stage. Then, still in relation to pools, but a different question now. To what extent was plasma that was being used for the production of specific immunoglobulins, was that processed separately from plasma fractionated to produce factor concentrates?
Yes, the hyperimmune pools were always processed completely separately. No other product was manufactured from them other than the immunoglobulin.
So there should be no cross-contamination? No. I want to ask you next about the relationship between the PFC and a number of other organisations and bodies. So first of all, PFC's relationship with the wider SNBTS. How did that work in principle?
In principle, PFC was part of SMBTS. It began as part of SMBTS and remains part of SMBTS.
And so what kind of dealings or interactions took place between PFC and the regional transfusion services that made up the remainder of SNBTS?
As we've touched on, PFC originated as part of a regional transfusion centre, and when I arrived, quite a lot of the analytical work was being done by the staff in the regional transfusion centre, including factor VIII assays, and that relationship continued when we moved to PFC, and that we would still get factor VIII assays done by the regional transfusion centre in Edinburgh. And even when we were entirely running our own factor VIII assays, we would get duplicates done with the Edinburgh Centre just for security. So there was always a continuing relationship. The relationship with Glasgow was less strong because it was further away, and obviously the other centres, but there was always a good relationship, and that was through the directors who met regularly, and we met, I mean, as I talked about earlier this morning, I was leading a project team which involved senior technical staff from all of the transfusion centres throughout Scotland. And so the staff knew each other well, there was lots of interactions. And I mean, just as an aside, the scientific staff independently began to meet under their own volition to share findings. From about 1974, we would have regular scientific meetings that were just kind of ad hoc. And that led ultimately to the formation of an annual conference called the Scot Blood Conference. But that began with the scientific staff taking their own initiative to meet independently.
Now, the role that you've described of the PFC as part of SNBTS, in the way in which you've just referred to, is obviously different from the relationship between BPL and the regional transfusion centres in England and Wales. Do you have any thoughts or observations about any advantages or disadvantages for a fractionation centre of being part of a national blood transfusion service as opposed to being separate from it?
It was a huge advantage because that's where our raw material came from, and we were closely connected to them, so there were systems in place to ensure that we could get the raw material we needed and have a dialogue. I'm not sure that existed in England to the same extent.
Did you have any dealings on any regular basis with regional transfusion directors in England and Wales?
No.
And do you recall whether you or colleagues at the PFC had any sight of the minutes of the regular meetings that took place between regional transfusion directors in England and Wales?
I didn't. I don't know about that. I can't speak for the director.
Did you have any dealings yourself with the CSA, the Common Services Agency, in the 70s or 80s?
No, I can't remember having any.
And then the Scottish Home and Health Department, did you have direct dealings with SHHD, or was that left to Mr. Watt or Professor Cash?
I was invited by Mr. Watt to take part in the annual meetings that were held with the department and haemophilia directors and SMBTS from 1981. And I attended those meetings and through until 2008, I think. So I did attend those meetings. Much later, I attended various meetings at the department, but not in the 70s and 80s.
What then of the relationship with the haemophilia centres in Scotland? How did contact between the PFC and the haemophilia centres take place, if at all?
It was, to the best of my knowledge, it was via the medical staff of the transfusion service. It would be Professor Cash, Dr. Bolton, people like that, and also by attending the annual meeting with the haemophilia directors. Whether Mr. Watt had other arrangements, I don't know. I do know that he was a personal member of the Haemophilia Society, and he received the minutes of their meetings and bulletins, but that was very much on a personal basis because he wanted to be kept informed.
you've said in your statement that it was SNBTS policy, that it was the SNBTS medical staff that would interact with clinicians rather than PFC staff. Do you know why that was the policy?
PFC had no medically qualified staff on its books.
And then in terms of supplying PFC concentrates to haemophilia centres, did you have any dealings directly with the haemophilia centre directors in terms of their requirements?
No, that was never dealt with through me. It would always go to the director of PFC.
I'd ask you about one document at HSOC 00026990. This is a memo from you to Dr. Perry. It's the 18th of November 1986. You say, I've noticed there's a meeting of SNBTS and haemophilia directors due in February. In the past, information has not been particularly forthcoming from this group, and I wonder if we should perhaps table some formal questions in advance of the meeting. And then you set out a number of questions, in particular in relation to HIV positivity and treatment history. Are you able to elaborate upon that second sentence, information in the past having not been particularly forthcoming from this group? What kind of information had PFC had wanted but not obtained?
Well, I think number one in this list is how many patients there were in Scotland. And I think not so much myself, but Professor Cash was always trying to find out more about how much commercial product was used and didn't always get satisfactory information. And those were the issues I think that we had difficulty with, because it would have helped us to know, or Professor Cash for planning purposes, to know about these things. And I think the other points here is just kind of my brainstorming at that point in time, what would it be useful to know about? But I don't know if any of this ever happened.
And you've observed in your statement that you had less contact with haemophilia clinicians than Dr. Smith did in, from his perspective at PFL, BPL. I think it's right, you didn't attend meetings of UK HCDO or have access to their minutes, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Would it have been useful, do you think, for you to be able to either attend the meetings or have at least access to copies of what was being discussed?
From the minutes that I've seen, I would say yes. Not so much attending the meetings, because they were very, very large attendance, but having access to the minutes would have been helpful to me. And in particular, there was one piece of information, technical information in 1 minute that would have been very important for me to know, but I didn't know it at the time.
And what was that? That
was the technique that Baxter used to enable them to dry heat treat their product.
Well, I may come back to that then tomorrow and ask you about that a little more. You've referred to Mr. Watt being a member of the Haemophilia Society. Did you have any particular relationship or connection with the Haemophilia Society?
No, I didn't.
Okay. And then in terms of the relationship with BPL, your statement suggests that you and your colleagues, your scientific colleagues at PFC, had a good relationship with Dr. Smith and others at BPL. Is that correct?
Yes.
The inquiry's seen evidence that might suggest the relationship between Mr. Watt and Dr. Lane was not a harmonious or positive one. Did you have any knowledge of that at the time?
No, I can't say I did. I only met Dr. Lane a small number of times, and I only remember him coming to PFC once and being shown around, and everything was quite cordial.
Do you think there was room for improvement in terms of the joint working arrangements between BPL and PFL on the one hand and PFC on the other?
I don't. I think we got on extremely well. All of the staff who knew their counterparts and could phone them any time, and it was a two-way process. I mean, we saw them as being part of the same organisation, just a different branch, And being a highly specialised area of work, if you're working on something and there's only one person in the country who's doing the same thing, then they're the person you want to talk to. And so that happened. I mean, we did have this dialogue.
And then can I ask you to look at one document, PRSE 00036692. Sorry, I might have said that wrong. PRSC 303962. Sorry, Sally. This is a minute dated the 30th of August, or a memo dated the 30th of August 1988 from Dr. Forrester to the Chief Medical Officer. So it's an internal SHHD document, as I understand it. And I just wanted to read the first two paragraphs and then ask you whether you have any observation. It says, Mr. Hamill questions the lack of proper R&D links between Scotland and England. Formal attempts to forge them have been made and collapse into acrimony. I attach a DHSS minute of the 10th of June 87, saddling Scotland with the blame. However that may be, the indications are, and I think Dr. Scott would agree, that only coercion from above and some resolute decisions about R&D funding would get SNBTS and CBLA to make common cause. It should be remembered, as I pointed out to Mr. Donald some time ago, that the picture of Punch, England, and Judy, Scotland, at blows is only what is presented to DH and to SHHD. If you go behind the scenes after the show, the two are in bed together. For instance, PFC are conducting virus elimination research for BPL now by mutual arrangement. Now, this is someone else's opinion, obviously, that's being referred to here. But from your own perspective, do you have any either knowledge of or reflections on what's set out there, both in terms of the reference to acrimony and absence of common cause, but also the reference to behind-the-scenes mutual cooperation?
I'm very familiar with the behind-the-scenes mutual cooperation because shortly after I joined PFC in 1973, Mr. Watt asked me to lead a delegation from PFC to BPL so that the staff could meet their counterparts. And neither he nor Dr. Smith nor Mr. Grant, who were the senior staff, attended because they wanted the middle grading staff to meet their counterparts without any involvement of themselves. And I think there were about a dozen of us went down to BPL for the day, and everybody met their counterparts, got to know who they were, and were encouraged to dialogue. And the BPL made a reciprocal visit to PFC. So at my level, and even the level below me, there was a lot of what is called being in bed together was going on really from the mid-1970s. If there was any problems at a senior level, we didn't know about it.
I'm going to move to a different topic now, which is that of self-sufficiency, with a focus on Scotland. And I'm then going to ask you about the ability of PFC to fractionate plasma from elsewhere. I'll just start with part of your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry at PRSE 0006022. If we go to page 43, I just wanted to pick up the picture at the bottom 10 lines or so from line 18 down. We said this PFC had only just opened, so we're in probably around 1976 at this point, and it was opened with some kind of expectation that this was going to solve everyone's problems. And of course that didn't happen because the targets that had been set turned out to be not what happened. The demand went up and up and up and up, and really we were just chasing this ever-increasing demand as hard as we could. And Dr. Cash was banging the drum to get more and more plasma, and we were doing, go to the top of the next page, please. Everything we could to produce more and more. But of course, the aspirations of the doctors and the patients, which one can understand, is that this was so successful that they were running ahead of us all the time. Now, first of all, does that remain your recollection of the picture as at perhaps 75, 76, 77?
And beyond.
So how did it change, as far as you can recall? Or to what extent did it change?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the
So,
question.
forgive me, let me make the question clearer. Here you're talking about demand going up, so demand for concentrates, as I understand it, is what you're referring to, increasing. So the targets that you needed to meet changing. Dr. Cash wanting to get more and more plasma. Did there come a point at which that picture changed, and if so, roughly when?
Firstly, the difficulty was that information on how much was being used was always available retrospectively, because it was collected by HCDO, and by the time it was processed, it was maybe 18 months or even 2 years out of date. So we were really driving in the dark, and we were trying to hit a moving target in the dark. And so you were dependent to some extent, and this really amounts to the plasma side, in trying to predict how much plasma was required. And I think this is where Professor Cash probably made a big difference. Before Professor Cash, the National Medical Director was Major General Jeffrey, and he died at the end of 1976. And there was a hiatus, really, until Dr. Cash took over in 1979. And I think his first task was to begin to reconsider this area. And instead of kind of looking in the rear-view mirror, he started to try and plan prospectively what might be required in terms of clinical needs of patients in the future. And he came up with figures that were quite different to those that had been seen before. And I remember meeting him. I was going to a conference where I was giving a presentation on self-sufficiency. And he said, "What's the target for factor 8? And I gave him the target that General Jeffrey had produced. And he just laughed in my face and he said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Then he got on the train and got in the first-class compartment, and I didn't see him again. But he was working at figures that were completely different to those that General Jeffrey had.
And different in what way? Much smaller or much larger?
Sorry, much larger.
So once, well, I don't want to put words into your mouth. So you paint a picture then of Dr. Cash, Professor Cash coming along, producing targets or figures that were more realistic as far as PFC understood the position. Is that right?
Yes.
And then how did PFC respond in terms of trying to meet that increase?
It wasn't so much PFC, it was getting more plasma. That was the limitation. And that was where Cash played a very strong part. He took that, took it on very aggressively indeed.
If we just go back to your evidence to the Archer inquiry, ARCH 609, page 37, I believe. You identify here, I think, two measures in terms of trying to meet the demand. If we pick it up, well, actually, we'll read, I think, probably the whole page. When it was realised this would not be the case, that refers to an assumption that you'd obtain sufficient factor VIII as a byproduct of albumin. Considerable effort was made to increase the production of factor VIII concentrate. The amount of plasma required could not be met by recruiting more donors. Instead, plasma had to separate from blood soon after donation, leaving hospitals to use red cells instead of whole blood for transfusion, a concept known as component therapy. You were asked then what period of time that was referring to, late 70s, early 1980s. You say this was a major change to establish medical practice, and to encourage hospital doctors to make this change, SNBTS medical staff embarked on a process of education and persuasion. SNBTS eventually stopped issuing whole blood altogether unless it was first approved by an SNBTS doctor. And then you go on to talk about a second element, which I'll come on to in a moment, because that's one you were directly involved in. But presumably what's set out here is not something you would have had direct knowledge of. This is your understanding of what was happening more widely within SNBTS, essentially the use of red cell concentrates.
That's my understanding, yes.
And then The second element that you describe in your evidence to the Archer inquiry was the increase of factor 8 yield. And you say that you managed to increase that by about 60%. Over what period of time was that done, roughly?
I probably began that in the 76, 77 period, but that major increase occurred when I started to introduce the continuous thawing process in 1979, 1981. That was when that had the biggest impact.
Okay. And in short and simple terms, how was that done? How did you increase factor 8 yield significantly?
In the first steps that I took, I fine-tuned each of the steps in the manufacturing process. For example, there were different, you had to mix the cryoprecipitate to dissolve it, and there were different mixes that were available, and I examined which one was best in terms of not damaging the factor 8. And there were various adjustments like changing pH or adding various chemicals, and I examined every step just to optimize it absolutely. And at the end of that process, there were some increases. When you eventually got to the end of the process, it came out with a higher yield. But eventually, it was when we moved on to the continuous thawing, which was able to... The problem with batch thawing is that in order to melt the plasma, you have to add heat. But the factor 8, which was in the cryoprecipitate, would redissolve once the temperature got to about 3 or 4 degrees centigrade. And in the batch tank, the temperature of the water to heat it was about maybe 20 or 30 degrees at the wall. And so any cryoprecipitate at the wall would start to redissolve, and the factor 8 would go back into the solution. The continuous process allowed us to take the melted plasma with the factor 8 with the cryoprecipitate in suspension away from the source of heat as soon as it melted, so it didn't have a chance to redissolve. And that was the major achievement in being able to prevent that factor 8 redissolving, so it was retained in the cryoprecipitate and could then be processed into the final product. So, at the same time, that because we had more factor 8, that gave us an increased potency, it gave us an increased purity, and it dissolved more quickly.
So when we're talking about increasing factor 8 yield, this is maybe a massive oversimplification, but you're talking about getting essentially more factor 8 at the end out of the same amount of plasma.
That's correct.
Leaving aside the CSVM process, which PFC had but BPL didn't have, were any of the other methods you used being used at BPL, as far as you know?
Method of preparation of factor 9 was identical at that time. I think in the early days, the method of factor 8 was virtually identical as well. The chemistry for producing the products was similar, but technically they used the batch process and we had the continuous process. But the chemical changes, the additives that you introduced to cause the changes in solubility were pretty much the same principles.
So does it go back to then the major advantage that you had at PFC over BPL on this point was the availability of the CSVM method? And then just in terms of the first way or the first method we discussed, which was the use of red cell concentrates instead of whole blood, you referred in your evidence to Archer and indeed in your evidence to the Penrose inquiry to there being programmes in relation to trying to educate clinicians and so on in relation to that. Is that something of which you have any direct knowledge?
No.
So you picked that up from the documents, essentially? I
remember being present at a meeting where Dr. Cash was encouraging the medical staff to be even stronger with their clinical colleagues in the hospitals. He wasn't happy with the progress that was being made. And I was present when that was taking place, but other than that, I have no knowledge.
What is the point in time at which you would say if there was a point in time, Scotland became self-sufficient in factor concentrates?
I think when we look back, we can see, I mean, in the 70s, I always thought there'd be a plateau and we'd meet the demand and then it would settle out. But that, in reality, that never happened. The amount of factor rate being used has increased year on year on year on year on year until the present, almost to the present day. So the issue then was, going back year by year, was could you meet the demand at any particular point in time, given that it was actually going to be an increasing demand? Could you meet it at any point in time? And I think there are a number of points in time where we did meet the demand from our own resources. And I've documented those in my documents for the Penrose inquiry, and I think it's around about 1983.
You said, I think, in your evidence to the Archer inquiry, and I think probably also to the Penrose inquiry, that Scotland was the first in the world to achieve self-sufficiency from voluntary donations. What's the basis for your understanding of that claim?
I wasn't aware of any other country that had achieved that from all of any documents or literature or I'd read or any people I'd spoken to.
Did you yourself undertake any particular investigations or inquiries into what had happened in other countries?
My general knowledge was that virtually all countries were importing commercial factor rates from the United States. The US was supplying 70% of the world's needs for concentrate at that time. And the only countries that maybe didn't were reliant on cryoprecipitate or on no treatment at all.
Does it follow from that the United States itself was self-sufficient?
Yes, when I say self-sufficient, I mean self-sufficient from unpaid donors.
Right. So that's the definition we're using.
Yes.
Yes, and I should have, I think the way in which I put it was, the way in which you put it to the Archer and Penrose inquiry was the achievement of self-sufficiency from voluntary donations was the point that you advanced to those inquiries. Did you have, back in the late 70s, early 80s, any knowledge about the extent to which particular centres in Scotland might be using commercial concentrates?
I didn't have any direct knowledge, but I am aware now that Mr. Watt was involved in dialogue and correspondence with some of the centres about that, and there was concern about that.
By way of example, the inquiries had evidence in particular relating to the use of commercial concentrates at York Hill. Leave aside any documents that you might have seen years later. Do you recall that ever being discussed within PFC in the 70s or early 80s?
No.
Want to turn then to England and Wales. I'm going to look largely at the extent to which plasma from England and Wales might have been fractionated at the PFC. But before I do that, there's just one short point that perhaps we can pick up before the lunch break. If we go to PRSE 40545, please. This is one of your written statements to the Penrose inquiry. And if we go to page 3, there's a heading, the policy of the United Kingdom government on self-sufficiency. Now, I'm not, for the most part, going to be asking you about that because, as I understand it, for the most part, it's not something you had direct knowledge of at the time. But there was a point in time at which you had some interactions through the union of which you were part, the ASTMS. And you refer in this section of your statement to your understanding that Mrs. Thatcher's government announced support for self-sufficiency only after a trades union, the ASTMS, campaigned against a proposal by the government to privatise BPL, and an investigation was undertaken by journalists from Granada TV. And you describe you having a direct involvement in both of those activities. Can you just again, assist us in understanding how you came to be involved in that issue, and briefly what steps you yourself took on that point?
But during 1980, as you know, it was appreciated that BPL needed to be rebuilt. And in beginning to plan for that, advice was being sought from experts across the UK as to what sort of technology the new BPL might use. And there was a working party set up under Dr. Dunhill from University College, and a number of us from PFC went to BPL to take part in these discussions and have these wide-ranging technical discussions about what new technology was available and what should or shouldn't be used. And it was in attending one of those meetings that I learned from Dr. Lane that there was a plan to sell, the government were planning to sell BPL to Beecham's, and I brought that to the notice of my trade union because I thought they should know about that. And personally, I was uncomfortable with that because I thought that might undermine the concept of the unpaid volunteer donor in the UK.
And I don't think we need to go to it, but we've got, I think, a handful of documents which are memorandums between our union officials or communications with you, and then communications between union officials and members of Parliament, which are at PRSE 303588. The way in which, again, without going to the detail of those, the way in which you put it in your statement was that your understanding is that that led to parliamentary questions being put on this issue. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then in relation to the second point that you made in your statement, the World in Action investigation into the potential privatisation of BPL, what was your involvement in that issue?
Well, I'd been at another meeting at BPL, I think it must have been late September, and Dr. Lane was very, very distressed, and he basically said Beecham's are about to sign on the dotted line, and he was clearly unsympathetic to that approach, but felt that was going to be what was going to happen. And I happened to be, before I came back to Edinburgh, I dropped off to visit an old friend in London, and I just happened to mention this in conversation. And then 2 days later, I got a phone call from a journalist from World in Action who was interested in this issue. And he had been involved in the earlier World in Action programme that had been shown in the mid-1970s. And his name was Laurie Flynn. And so I told him all I knew about it, and he then began to carry out his own investigations. And then one day I got a phone call, and he said, could he come to my flat to see me? And I said, of course. And about 10 minutes later, he turned up with a colleague, and they had a copy of the BPL inspection report, which I had never seen. I knew it existed, and they wanted me to explain what it meant. So we spent 2 or 3 hours going through it, and I did my best to point out what it meant. And then he some time later, he phoned, and he said that his colleague, who was called Michael Gillard, had made a discovery, and they had prepared a programme that was going to be broadcast the following Monday. But before they could broadcast that programme, they were required by Granada Television to inform the minister. And he was going to do that the next day. The next day, which was the Friday, he phoned me back to say he had informed the minister, and that afternoon there had been a parliamentary question tabled asking what was going to happen to BPL, and the minister had replied that it would stay in the NHS.
Now, you won't know, presumably, what internal discussions were going on within the Department of Health or what advice may or may not have been given about that option. But in terms of your own interactions with BPL, was it your impression or understanding that Dr. Lane at least understood this to be a serious proposal?
Oh, it was very, as I said, he believed they were about to sign on the dotted line was how he actually expressed it. So it was very advanced.
The parliamentary answer from the Minister, I think, was 26th of November, and the reference for that, we don't need to put it on screen, but it's just for the benefit of those following, is PRSE 5063. So I'm going to move to the question
Can I just say that,
yes.
the programme that was intended to go out the following Monday did not go out.
It went out a little later.
It was changed because the Minister had changed his position, and so the programme was changed.
So I'm going to move to now the next topic, which is the potential for plasma from elsewhere to be fractionated at PFC, which will take a little while. So bearing in mind it's nearly 1:05, perhaps we could take lunch now.
Yes, well, let's take a break then until 2:05. 2:05.